The year was 1987, and the Reagan era was in full swing. Hollywood's glittering elite had gathered at the Beverly Hills Hotel for what was supposed to be a charitable fundraiser for literacy programs across America. The irony of what would unfold. That evening would not be lost on anyone present. Robert De Niro, at the height of his career, following his acclaimed performances in Taxi Driver and Raging Bull, sat at a table surrounded by fellow actors, directors, and producers. The conversation had naturally drifted toward politics, as it often did in those circles during the Reagan years. The actor, known for his intense method acting and equally intense political opinions, had been growing increasingly vocal about his disdain for the current administration. "I just don't understand how this country elected an actor to be president," De Niro said, his voice carrying that familiar Brooklyn intensity, even in casual conversation. And not just any actor, a B-movie actor from the 50s. The man is completely uneducated about real policy, real economics, real international relations. The table fell silent for a moment. Several heads nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Steven Spielberg, who was seated nearby, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The sentiment wasn't uncommon in Hollywood circles, but the vehemence in De Niro's voice gave everyone pause. "I mean, what does Ronald Reagan really know about running a country?" De Niro continued, warming to his theme. "He was a sports announcer who couldn't even make it as a serious actor. Now he's making decisions that affect millions of people, and he's doing it based on what instinct? Hollywood charm? It's embarrassing." Word of De Niro's comments spread quickly through the interconnected web of Hollywood society. Within days, the remarks had made their way through various channels' agents, publicists, political operatives, and eventually to Washington itself. In an era before social media, gossip still traveled at remarkable speed, especially when it involved celebrities and politics. President Reagan, as it happened, was scheduled to attend a similar fundraising event in Los Angeles the following week. When his advance team briefed him on the various attendees and potential talking points, they mentioned De Niro's comments almost in passing, expecting perhaps a dismissive chuckle or a request to avoid seating them near each other. Instead, Reagan's eyes lit up with what his staff had learned to recognize as his storytelling expression. "You know," the president said, leaning back in his chair in the Oval Office, "that reminds me of something that happened back in my Warner Brothers days. Maybe it's time I shared that story." The following week, the Beverly Hills Country Club was filled with an even more prestigious gathering than the previous event. This time, President Reagan himself was the keynote speaker, ostensibly there to discuss his administration's education initiatives. The audience was a mix of Hollywood royalty, business leaders, and political figures, including, by unfortunate coincidence of Los Angeles social circles, Robert De Niro. Reagan took the podium with his characteristic easy smile and commanding presence. At 76, he had lost none of the charisma that had made him a movie star and helped propel him to the highest office in the land. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice warm and conversational despite the formal setting. "You know, before we talk about education and literacy, I'd like to share a story with you. It's about the importance of not judging a book by its cover, or in this case, not judging a person by their Hollywood resume." In the audience, De Niro felt a slight chill. Something about the president's tone suggested this wasn't going to be a typical political speech. "Back in 1952, Reagan continued, "I was under contract at Warner Brothers. Now I'll be the first to admit, I wasn't exactly considered leading man material for the prestige pictures. I did my share of B-movies, westerns, and what we used to call programmers, the films that filled the bottom half of double features." A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Reagan's self-deprecating humor was well known, but there was something different about his delivery tonight. "One day I was called into a meeting with Jack Warner himself, the head of the studio. Now Jack was known for being tough, sometimes cruel, and he had a particular disdain for actors who he thought were getting too big for their britches. He was also, though few people knew it at the time, functionally illiterate. The room grew quieter. This was not the direction anyone had expected the speech to take. Jack Warner had built one of the most powerful entertainment empires in the world, but he had dropped out of school in the 4th grade to help support his family. He was brilliant with numbers, had an incredible instinct for what audiences wanted, and could negotiate deals that left Harvard Business School graduates scratching their heads. But he couldn't read a script to save his life. Reagan paused, letting this information sink in. The studio had developed an elaborate system to work around this. Scripts would be summarized for him in meetings. Assistants would read important documents aloud. When he needed to review contracts, he would have lawyers explain every clause in detail while he committed it all to memory, and his memory was phenomenal. De Niro found himself leaning forward, despite himself. Where was this story going? So, there I was in Jack's office, and he had apparently heard some unflattering comments about my intelligence from someone on the lot. "Reagan," he said to me, "I hear you're some kind of intellectual, that you read books and think you're smarter than the rest of us simple folk here in Hollywood." Reagan's impression of the gruff studio head drew more laughter from the audience. Now I should mention that this was during my phase of being very involved in the Screen Actors Guild. I was reading everything I could get my hands on about labor relations, economics, political theory. I had strong opinions about the direction of the industry and the country. Some people thought I was getting a bit too big for my britches, politically speaking. The president's eyes seemed to find De Niro in the audience for just a moment. Jack Warner looked at me across that massive desk of his and said, "I want you to read something for me." He handed me a script, a new picture they were developing. "Read the whole thing," he said, "and then tell me what you think, not just about your part, but about the whole story. Give me your honest opinion about whether this picture will make money." Reagan paused to take a sip of water. So I read the script. It was a war picture set in the Pacific. The story followed a group of soldiers fighting their way across various islands, culminating in a major battle. It was well written, exciting, and I could see the potential for great performances and spectacular action sequences. "But, Reagan," continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "I also noticed something else. The script was historically inaccurate in several key ways. The timeline was wrong. The military tactics described wouldn't have worked in the real battles they were supposed to represent, and some of the technical details about equipment and weapons were completely off." When I went back to Jack's office, I told him all of this. I praised the writing, the character development, the potential for box office success. But I also explained the historical problems, complete with references to military histories I had been reading. Jack listened to everything I said, nodding occasionally, asking a few questions. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You know what, Reagan?" he said. "You're absolutely right about those historical details. I knew you would be." The audience was completely absorbed now. Even the waiters had stopped moving around the room. "It turned out," Reagan said, "that Jack Warner had deliberately given me a script filled with errors. He had commissioned his writers to create historically inaccurate scenarios specifically to test whether I would catch them. And not just catch them, but whether I would have the knowledge and the courage to point them out to one of the most powerful men in Hollywood. You see, Jack had a problem. He wanted to make a series of war pictures, but he needed someone he could trust to catch historical and technical errors before they made it to screen. Someone who would do the research, who would push back when something didn't make sense, who wouldn't just go along to get along. Reagan's voice grew warmer, more personal. That day, Jack Warner offered me something that would change my life. Not just a better contract or a bigger part in his next picture. He offered me a position as an unofficial historical consultant on all of Warner Brothers' military and political films. He wanted me to read scripts, research historical backgrounds, and work with writers to ensure accuracy. But here's the most important part of the story, Reagan said, his eyes now definitely focused on De Niro's section of the audience. Jack Warner, a man with a fourth-grade education, a man who couldn't read the very scripts that made him millions, had the wisdom to recognize that education comes in many forms. He understood that someone might know things he didn't, even if they didn't have the formal credentials or the prestigious background. The room was absolutely silent now. Over the next several years, working on those films taught me more about American history, military strategy, international relations, and the complexities of global politics than I had learned in all my years of formal schooling combined. I studied everything from the Revolutionary War to World War II, from economic policy to diplomatic protocol. Reagan's voice took on a note of quiet intensity. When I eventually became involved in politics, first as president of the Screen Actors Guild, then as governor of California, and eventually in this job, the foundation of knowledge I built during those years at Warner Brothers served me well. Not because I had a college degree or because I came from the right background, but because I had learned to ask questions, to do research, to challenge assumptions my own and others. The president paused, looking out over the audience. Jack Warner, that supposedly uneducated mogul, taught me one of the most valuable lessons of my life. Never assume that the person standing in front of you doesn't know something you need to know. Never assume that someone's background tells you everything about their intelligence, their wisdom, or their capacity to surprise you. Reagan smiled, that familiar, warm expression that had charmed audiences for decades. I think about that lesson often in this job. When I meet with world leaders, some of whom come from very different educational backgrounds than what we might expect. When I work with members of Congress who took unconventional paths to public service. When I review policies proposed by advisors who might be considered outsiders by traditional Washington standards. The president's eyes seemed to sweep across the entire audience, but De Niro felt as though they lingered on him for just a moment longer than the rest. The point of tonight's event is to promote literacy and education, and those are incredibly important causes. But I would submit to you that education is not just about formal schooling or prestigious credentials. Real education is about curiosity, about the willingness to learn from anyone and everyone, about having the humility to recognize that wisdom can come from the most unexpected sources. Reagan concluded his remarks to thunderous applause, but the real drama came afterward, during the reception. Robert De Niro, who had been unusually quiet throughout the evening, approached the president during the receiving line. "Mr. President," De Niro said, extending his hand. That was quite a story. Reagan smiled and shook the actor's hand warmly. "I hope you didn't mind the indirect nature of it, Mr. De Niro. Sometimes the best way to make a point is through a story rather than a lecture." De Niro was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I may not agree with all of your policies, Mr. President, but I have to admit I underestimated you." "That story about Jack Warner was it true?" "Every word," Reagan replied. "In fact, if you're ever interested, I could show you some of the research files I still have from those Warner Brothers days. Boxes and boxes of historical documents, military manuals, diplomatic correspondence. I became quite the amateur historian." The two men stood there for a moment, sizing each other up with a new level of mutual respect. "Mr. President," De Niro said finally, "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about you based on limited information, and that was unfair." Reagan waved off the apology with characteristic grace. "No need for that, Mr. De Niro. We all make assumptions sometimes. The important thing is being willing to revise them when we get new information." As the evening wound down, several observers noted that Robert De Niro seemed unusually thoughtful. In subsequent interviews over the years, the actor would occasionally reference that evening, describing it as a reminder of the importance of Intellectual humility. The story of Reagan's evening became something of a legend in both Hollywood and political circles. It was seen as a masterful example of how to handle critics, not with anger or defensive responses, but with a story that illustrated a larger point about the nature of intelligence, education, and the dangers of assumptions. For Reagan, it was simply another example of the power of storytelling, a skill he had honed over decades in Hollywood and perfected during his political career. But for those who witnessed it, the evening served as a reminder that sometimes the most effective response to criticism is not a counterattack, but a well-told story that changes the entire frame of the conversation. Years later, when scholars and biographers would analyze Reagan's presidency, many would point to moments like this as examples of his political skill. He had taken a personal attack and transformed it into a teachable moment, not just for his critic, but for everyone present. He had demonstrated both his knowledge and his grace under pressure, while simultaneously making a broader point about the nature of wisdom and education. The evening at the Beverly Hills Country Club became a footnote in the larger Reagan legacy. But for those who were there, it remained a vivid example of how a master communicator could turn a potential confrontation into an opportunity for reflection and, ultimately, mutual respect. In the end, both men emerged from the encounter with their reputations enhanced, De Niro for his willingness to acknowledge his mistake, and Reagan for his masterful handling of criticism through the ancient art of storytelling. It was, in many ways, a perfect encapsulation of the Reagan style, never mean-spirited, always educational, and invariably effective. Epilogue. The lasting impact. Reverberations of that evening continued long after the last guest had departed. The Beverly Hills Country Club, within Hollywood circles, the story spread like wildfire, but with an interesting twist. It wasn't told as a tale of political triumph or embarrassment, but rather as a masterclass in grace, under pressure, and the power of well-timed storytelling. Robert De Niro, true to his character, didn't simply retreat into silence after his encounter with Reagan. In the weeks that followed, he began what those close to him described as a period of genuine self-reflection. The actor, known for his meticulous preparation for roles, applied that same thoroughness to understanding the man he had so quickly dismissed. He began reading Reagan's speeches, not as an opponent looking for weaknesses, but as someone trying to understand a different perspective. He watched old films from Reagan's Warner Brothers days, paying attention not to the acting, but to the historical accuracy Reagan had mentioned. He even went so far as to contact some of Reagan's former colleagues from his Screen Actors Guild days, seeking to understand how the future president had operated in those early political roles. What De Niro discovered surprised him. Reagan's involvement in the Screen Actors Guild hadn't been ceremonial. He had been deeply engaged in complex negotiations involving studio contracts, worker rights, and the emerging threat of communist influence in Hollywood. The research Reagan had done for his historical consultant role at Warner Brothers was extensive and detailed, filling multiple filing cabinets with meticulously organized documents. "I had created a caricature in my mind," De Niro would later tell a close friend. "I saw what I expected to see an actor playing president. I didn't see the years of preparation, the genuine intellectual curiosity, the real policy work he had done as governor of California." Meanwhile, Reagan's staff noted a subtle change in the president's demeanor following the event. While he had always been gracious with critics, there seemed to be an extra warmth in his interactions with Hollywood figures. When other entertainment industry figures made similar criticisms in the press, Reagan's responses were notably measured and often included invitations for direct dialogue rather than public rebuttals. The president also began incorporating the Jack Warner story into other speeches and private conversations. It became one of his favorite examples when discussing the importance of looking beyond surface appearances, whether in international diplomacy or domestic policy discussions. Foreign diplomats who met with Reagan during this period often noted his emphasis on finding common ground and his apparent belief that everyone had something valuable to contribute to important conversations. 6 months after the Beverly Hills Country Club incident, an unexpected development occurred. Robert De Niro reached out to the White House through intermediaries, requesting a private meeting with President Reagan. The request was unusual, not a photo opportunity or a publicity event, but a genuine desire for substantive conversation. Meeting took place in the Oval Office on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Present were only Reagan, De Niro, and a single staff member taking notes. According to those notes, which wouldn't be declassified until years later, the conversation lasted nearly 2 hours and covered topics ranging from the role of artists in society to specific policy challenges facing the country. De Niro came prepared. He had spent weeks researching Reagan's policy positions, not to attack them, but to understand them. He asked thoughtful questions about welfare reform, military spending, and foreign policy initiatives. Reagan, clearly impressed by the actor's preparation, responded with detailed explanations that went far beyond typical political talking points. The most remarkable moment came when De Niro asked about Reagan's approach to criticism from the coincidental entertainment industry. Reagan smiled and shared another story, this one about his early days in radio when angry listeners would call the station to complain about his sports broadcasts. "You know, Bob," Reagan said, using the actor's preferred name, "I learned early on that the people who take the time to criticize you are often the ones who care the most. They're engaged, they're thinking, they're paying attention. The ones you have to worry about are the ones who ignore you completely." When the meeting concluded, both men emerged with a mutual respect that would endure for years. De Niro never became a Reagan supporter in the traditional political sense. Their policy disagreements remained significant, but he became something more valuable, a critic who understood the complexity of the man he was criticizing. The ripple effects of their encounter extended beyond their personal relationship. Other Hollywood figures, observing De Niro's more nuanced approach to political criticism, began to reconsider their own assumptions. The era of simple Hollywood versus Washington antagonism began to give way to more sophisticated political discourse within the entertainment industry. Reagan's handling of the De Niro situation also became a case study in political communication. Future presidents and their staffs would reference the Beverly Hills Country Club speech as an example of how to respond to criticism with dignity and effectiveness. The key lessons: respond with stories rather than attacks, acknowledge your critic's intelligence, and look for opportunities to build bridges, became standard elements of political training programs. Perhaps most importantly, the encounter served as a reminder of something that both Hollywood and Washington occasionally forgot: the power of direct, honest conversation between people who disagree. In an era increasingly dominated by political polarization and media soundbites, the Reagan-De Niro dialogue stood as an example of what could be accomplished when public figures set aside their preconceptions and engaged with each other as complex human beings rather than political caricatures. Years later, when Ronald Reagan announced his diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, Robert De Niro was among the Hollywood figures who sent private messages of support to the Reagan family. The note, which Nancy Reagan would treasure for years, reads simply, "Thank you for teaching me the importance of looking beyond first impressions. Your grace and wisdom made me a better person and a better citizen." The story of their encounter would be retold countless times in the years that followed, often as an example of American political discourse at its best. But for those who were present that evening at the Beverly Hills Country Club, it remained something more personal, a reminder that even in the midst of deep political divisions, there's always room for mutual respect, intellectual humility, and the transformative power of a well-told story. The legacy of that single evening would outlast both men's careers. serving as a beacon for future generations of public figures who found themselves on opposite sides of contentious issues. In a democracy, it suggested, the goal isn't to eliminate disagreement, but to elevate it, to transform conflict into conversation, assumptions into understanding, and criticism into the foundation for deeper dialogue. And perhaps that, more than any policy achievement or artistic triumph, was the most lasting gift that both Ronald Reagan and Robert De Niro gave to their country. Proof that even the deepest divides could be bridged by honesty, humility, and the simple act of treating one's opponents as fellow human beings worthy of respect and understanding.